Welcome to Proles of the Round Table.
Hello and welcome to Proles of the Round Table, where we sit down, have a few beers, and talk leftist history. Please do us a favor and subscribe on your favorite podcast app and rate or review to help extend our reach. Also, we've recently started a new Patreon, which you can reach at patreon.com/prolespod. Before we get started, we wanted to thank our sponsor, without whom we wouldn't have these lovely microphones or the 3 different computer screens that we're using to operate this ridiculous behemoth we've started. And that sponsor is Pyongyang Department Store #1, where you can get the people's chips.
Whoa.
I don't know. I've never been. Anyway.
There you go, DPRK. There's your slogan for the Pyongyang Department Store.
Is it? That's terrible. Today we have with us Comrade Natalie. What are you drinking today, Comrade Natalie?
I'm drinking iced tea.
Truly a proletarian beverage. There seems to be a trend when we have guests on that they don't want to get drunk with us. I don't know what's going on.
Do you ever just not get drunk to flex on Proles?
You sound way smarter when you do that.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm Jeremy. I'll be hosting this evening, and I am drinking Einstock. It's an Icelandic beer. It's a wee heavy, and it is a wee bit heavy. I'm scared. What you drinking, Nate Hop?
I'm pretty much just drinking water, recovering from being sick, so...
Fair enough.
Yeah, pretty boring tonight.
Justin.
All right, I'm drinking Go Play IPA by Avery Brewing Co. Ezra.
Oh man, okay. I'm drinking La Croix.
What flavor?
No, I was gonna say
Tangerine on a distant truck.
Okay, listen, this is the only
coconut.
bougie thing I dabble in, but yeah, it's coconut, so it's pretty good.
A whiff of distant coconut.
Yeah, you know what? It'd be like that sometimes.
It'd be like that. True. So tonight our topic is going to be the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Finally.
Not to be confused with Fake Korea or the Republic of Korea. So, Comrade Natalie, out of curiosity, what got you into this subject matter, I guess?
I first learned about the DPRK in late 2011 when Kim Jong-il passed. And I didn't really know much about Korea at all at the time. It wasn't really taught in school to me. Didn't know it was divided, certainly. And I didn't really understand why so many people were crying in the streets. The mass hysteria that was there at the time in Pyongyang when they were taking Kim Jong-il to where they lie their leaders in state. And I really wanted to learn more. And it took several years, but I realized that a lot of the narratives that we are told in the United States just flat out are not true. They are completely made up, don't have any historical backing, and over the course of several years I began to sympathize with the DPRK and want to help other people discover the truth that I did and come to support and offer solidarity with the Korean people.
Cool, and I understand you're also going to be launching like a newsletter in
Yes,
that direction?
I have a Patreon for me and my minor organization, the International Network for the Defense of Socialist Korea. And in October, we're launching a newsletter called Korea's One, which is a DPRK-centric newsletter that people can subscribe to and get in their mailbox every month.
Cool, very cool. So, awesome. Yeah, I guess getting into the main topic, where do you want to start?
Yes, okay, so I've unfortunately met a lot of Westerners that don't even know where Korea is geographically. They can't find it on a map. And so I just wanted to give some very quickly some very basic information on the geography of Korea. It is a peninsula in the heart of Northeast Asia. It has borders with modern-day Russia and China. To its east is Japan. It's surrounded by 3 seas on all sides, the East, West, and South Korean seas, although the east one is known in the West as the Sea of Japan. There's a lot of geographic variation in the peninsula, but the north is almost 80% mountainous, so almost the entire of that country is mountains and valleys, and that's how a lot of the villages are in the valleys and things like that. It averages around 1,400 feet above sea level, something like that.
Wow.
So lots of mountain ranges and things along those lines. Myeogyang, Kumgang, Chilbo, Kuwal, Hala. Paektu is the most important one. About 1 million years ago, actually, the volcano under Paektu erupted, and it left a crater called Heaven Lake in the center of the lake, which is very significant to Koreans. It's got a pretty temperate climate, moderate rainfall, distinct dry and rainy seasons, tons of diversity in wildlife, almost 10,000 native plant species in Korea, and almost 10,000 species of animals. So that's just some background information on the nature and wildlife of Korea.
I've seen pictures of the mountains and they look beautiful. Jeremy and I lived in South Korea for about a year when we were younger, and it's pretty there too, but it's mostly marshes and grasslands.
Lots and lots of like rice paddies everywhere.
Yeah, almost all of the farmable land is in the south, over 80% of it.
Yeah. We did actually get to visit the DPRK, sort of.
Kind of, yeah.
How so?
There's
Is it the DMZ?
At the DMZ, you walk across into the other side and then come back, and they tell you,
lame.
Don't wave at the North Korean soldiers. Don't make any eye contact with them. Don't smile at them because they'll use it for propaganda. And now I wish I'd been like, yay!
Yes. I wish I had smiled and waved and asked them to come get me.
Yeah, take me home. Anyway, so Natalie, where do you want to go next?
Okay, so I have a lot of history to go over, and I tried to do it as briefly as I could, especially early history. The earliest pottery that we have of Koreans in Korea was from around 8,000 BC. But people have been living there for millions of years in Korea.
Is that the Shulmun period? The 8,000 years ago?
Yes, correct, exactly. And followed was I'm not going to cover them too much, but there were periods of Korea for most of its time was warring feudal states, 3 kingdoms, those kind of periods, and the first Korean state was mostly united in 676. It wasn't officially until 918, but so these early years in ancient Korean history are just covered with really great examples of them overcoming foreign intervention, even when they're outnumbered. In 612, they repelled 3 million Sui soldiers. They repelled Tang soldiers in 645. Between 1231 and 1254, they repelled 6 different Mongol invasions. And then in 1592, they defeated the Japanese as well. And they were very advanced in technology, astrology, art, architecture. So many different metal types were invented in Korea, and so that's what that's a very, very, very summarized idea of early ancient Korean history.
Sure. Yeah.
So, in 918, Korea is finally unified for the first time completely by the Kingdom of Koryo. And so that dynasty lasts for about 500 years, and then it becomes the Kingdom of Great Joseon, and that lasted until about the 1900s. So now we're jumping forward a lot to the 1800s. Modern Korean history is very different from ancient Korean history because it's a big struggle between the Korean people and the imperialists and trying to find their independence and sovereignty. And really, at the very beginning of this era is the United States, as it's been ever since. And there were previous events before this, but one of the biggest ones was in 1866 when the U.S. ship General Sherman sailed up the Taedong River It looted villages, it burned them down, and when it was close to Pyongyang, Kim Ung-gyu, who is actually the great-grandfather of President Kim Il-sung, organized people in the town and attacked and sunk the ship. And they repelled several American invasions after that, including and a French one in 1867. So by now, some progressive and scholars and officials are starting to appear in Korean society, and they're advocating for the dismantling of feudalism, and they want capitalism. And there are so many peasant revolts at this time. All of them fail. The first bourgeois revolution was led in 1884, but it was overthrown with the help of foreign intervention from the Qing, who were ruling China at the time. And then shortly after that, slavery was abolished in 1894 in Korea, finally. And then in that same year that slavery was abolished, a few months later, in fact, 600,000 peasants rose up, and they were also massacred by the feudal government with the help of China and Japan. And not even a year later, the Queen of Korea was assassinated by Japanese agents who infiltrated the Korean palace. In 1905, Korea was finally made a protectorate of Japan after they had won the Russo-Japanese War for influence in Korea and Manchuria. And part of that, there were several Japan-Korea treaties that were forced upon Korea that were not legal, and they were under the threat of force. And the one in 1905, after a series of reductions of their army, it was finally, they had 20,000 soldiers in 1905, and suddenly they were told, you can only have 1,000. And a Japanese general by the name of Ito Hirobumi surrounded the Korean palace with troops and forced the Korean ministers to sign the document making Korea a protectorate. So
indefensible, basically, right?
Basically, yeah. And the way that they put it was they could muster up maybe 7,000 people with flintlock weapons against 200,000 trained soldiers and tens of warships. It would have been disastrous. And this part of this is it made a lot of people realize that maybe they can't deal with the Japanese by peaceful means.
Right.
And so during this period of Korea being a protectorate, there were several significant instances of Koreans resisting heroically, and there are so many stories in this period that just show off how dedicated people were to their independence and sovereignty, and how far they were willing to go to make their points. And I had just 3 quick stories here of resistance heroes that are revered in both North and South.
Okay.
That occurred between 1907 and 1909. In 1907, the King of Korea sent a delegation to The Hague for their convention in 1907 in the Netherlands. And part of that delegation was a patriot named by Ri Jun. And he was preparing to make remarks at the convention condemning Japanese occupation and imperialism, but the Japanese, American, and British delegations would not recognize him, or their delegation said that Korea was now under the protection of the Japanese, and they would not be allowed to speak. And so his last act of resistance, realizing that he could not complete this mission, was to go into one of the meeting halls with other delegates and disembowel himself.
Jesus.
God, that's gotta be
Yeah.
tough to do.
And then in March 1908, a U.S. diplomat named Durham Stevenson, who was a Japanese collaborator and an American advisor to the Korean feudal government, was going back to vacation in the United States, and he landed in San Francisco, and that day he gave an interview to a local paper where he said that Koreans were in fact very happy with losing their independence, and that they were overwhelmed with joy that the Japanese were going to protect the Koreans from now on. And 2 local organizations of Koreans in San Francisco were very upset by this, and they sent 4 associates to talk to Stevenson and they caught him in public and they asked him 2 questions. The first being if the comments in the paper were accurately attributed to him, and if Koreans were being killed by the Japanese in the occupation. He said yes to the first and no to the second. They immediately pushed him down and grabbed chairs and began beating him on the floor. They grabbed him by his head and started smashing his skull into the marble floor. Unfortunately, he didn't die. And the 2 Korean organizations at that time issued a statement saying that the only thing that they wished they had done differently was to kill him. And so the very next day, his injuries were not severe because he was going on a ferry to Oakland to continue his trip back to his family. And 2 young patriots by the names of John Myung-un and Jang In-won were mixed into a crowd of people at the ferry. And Jang Myung-un tried to shoot Stevenson, with the gun that was wrapped in a handkerchief, but it failed. And he immediately rushed Stevenson and began beating him in the face with the butt of his pistol. Jang, who saw this, he rushed to the fight and began shooting into the melee. He shot Stevens twice in the back and John once, but thankfully he recovered. Originally, papers had reported that Stevens would recover, but he died later. And when they were told in jail that he had finally died because they thought he would live, that they said that they were overcome with manifest delight, is how they put it. Jang served 10 years of a 25-year sentence and returned to Korea. He formed an orphanage in Pyongyang, but under oppression by the Japanese authorities, he returned to the U.S., where he committed suicide in 1930. And then in October 1909, the same general who led the surrounding of the Korean palace and forcing of treaties onto the Korean people was at a railway station along the border of Korea and Russia, and a patriot called An Jong-gun shot and killed him. He had become the resident general of Korea, so this was very significant, and he also shot 3 other senior Japanese authorities. In view of everybody, he immediately ripped out a Korean flag which he had made himself and began waving it, chanting independent slogans like Korea Forever. And after 6 trials, he was sentenced to death. The judge had promised that there would be a stay made for the execution, but officials in Tokyo insisted that it be done much, much sooner. And so he was hung on March 10 after only having asked to be killed in a set of traditional Korean clothes, which was the last act that the warden of the prison gave before resigning. And so, yeah, that's just a few stories from very brave Korean patriots that gave their lives to advocate for their people.
Nice.
Yeah. That's awesome. You can already see kind of the theme, repelling invaders over and over and over and over and over.
Yes. they have an indomitable spirit.
Willing to sacrifice everything.
Exactly,
to
yes,
do it.
precisely.
I had no idea that the North Korean spirit was so revolutionary to begin with. You know,
It's Korea as a whole at this point.
Oh,
it's not,
correct,
it's not
yeah.
divided yet.
Yeah, it's true.
So, Korea was finally annexed in 1910. The king refused to sign that document, and it was later ruled in a completely illegal treaty because it was, again, made under the threat of force to the king. But that ended Korea as a political entity, and it was now under Japanese control. There were so many great crimes that were perpetrated onto the Korean people by the Japanese during their occupation. For instance, in just 1911, they barred Koreans from having Japanese names and forced those who had changed their name to a Japanese name to then retake on Korean names. Though later, they banned all Korean names and forced everyone to have Japanese names once the policy began to shift from enlightening a lesser race to, oh, Koreans and Japans are one and the same. You're trying to culturally assimilate.
Wow.
Over 300,000 Korean women were taken as sex slaves by the Japanese Imperial Army. Most were forced abroad, away from their families forever. Millions of people were taken from Korea to Japan, and that's part of why Japan has such a significant population of Koreans today. Over 5.4 million people were conscripted for forced labor for the Japanese war efforts, and at least 200,000 to 800,000 died from that forced labor.
It's out of do you know the population? Out of what population?
I think that at the time it was around 20 million.
Fuck.
Yeah. So there had been a few independence organizations that had sprung up, but the revolution of 1917 in Russia had really changed the political landscape of Korea, and a lot of people were starting to learn about Marxism, Leninism. In March 17, Kim Hyong-jik, who is the president, Kim Il-sung's father, founded the Korean National Association, which was one of the first and largest underground anti-Japanese revolutionary organizations at the time. And they weren't communists at first; they were progressives, relative progressives, and they were very popular at the time. In fact, in autumn of 1917. Japanese authorities were so worried by the growing numbers of the Korean National Association that they rounded up over 100 high-ranking officials, including Kim Hyong-jik, and they were arrested. And it's a story told a lot in the North of Kim Il-sung having to watch his father be abused and arrested by the Japanese authorities. And while he was in prison, he pondered over the progress of the movement that he was so involved in, and he really became convinced that they could not achieve independence by peaceful means, and that a proletarian revolution was the only way that they would be achieving national liberation. And after being released, he shifted his political activities to the northern border areas around China. And changed most people see this as a resolute change in the course of the independence movement, from one that was very nationalist-centric one to one that is becoming communist. And then in 1919, nationwide uprisings happened and spread to all areas where Koreans were, like in China, Russia, Japan. There were even demonstrations in Hawaii at the time, and California. In Korea, however, these were very brutally repressed, and tens of thousands were killed or wounded. And that's when a lot of people, it became a very mainstream idea that they cannot achieve independence by peaceful means, and that armed struggle was the correct path forward.
Okay. So, I guess, I mean, I know that the Japanese were somewhat brutal in their repression of the Korean people. Do you feel like that brutality is directly, like, had the Japanese been less oppressive, do you think that the Korean people would have been less likely to rise up or more likely to rise up? Just
oh man, I mean, tough call. I think that they definitely did not want to be under Japan's rule. They wanted to be independent, and there were so many instances of Koreans who went out of their way to try to work with the Western powers and Japan to try to convince them that Korea's independence would be to their own benefit. Yeah. But it was just
which is a theme that is like told over and over. I mean, Vietnam did that, China did that, the Soviet Union did that before it was the Soviet Union.
Cuba
did that. Fidel Castro all of them appealed to the West, thinking that the American sense of freedom aligned with their sense of freedom, only to find out, they don't give a fuck about they don't give a fuck. Just rebranded imperialism.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about Kim Il-sung. Okay. He was born on April 15th, 1912, in Myeongdae, which is a part of Pyongyang. His family were all poor peasants, though that they had obviously a strong history in the resistance movement. Obviously, his father was the leader of the Korean National Association. His great-grandfather sunk U.S. ships. His mother was an independence and communist activist who today is known as the Mother of Korea. And
That is so cool.
one of the most notable things is that her and Kim Il-sung's father were both Presbyterians. And in fact, two of the Protestant churches in Pyongyang today are named after her. Kim Il-sung studied history and current affairs and Marxist-Leninist theory from a very young age, even in middle school. And at the age of 14 in 1926, he founded the Town with Imperialism Union, which was one of the first communist organizations in all of Korean history.
Just as sorry to interrupt, but just as like a real quick aside, did communism lead you to sympathy with the DPRK, or did the DPRK lead you to communism?
I was a progressive when I started learning about the DPRK, but it definitely helped radicalize me, along with many other people.
Nice. Okay, I was just curious.
I just have another really quick side question.
Go for it.
How did you not fall for the like Western propaganda of the DPRK and like that whole narrative?
I mean, well, okay. I had only heard about the DPRK in the context, of it being some beyond, World War II Holocaust levels of atrocities, and just, there's not a moment of happiness or contentment. It's just all 24/7 misery. That didn't really make much sense to me. I had always been pretty passionate about the anti-war movement. I see a lot of similarities between the disinformation campaigns perpetrated against Iraq, Cuba, I guess today Venezuela, Syria, Vietnam. Just this seems like a very common thing in American history. Okay, so he was arrested, Kim Il-sung, in autumn 1929 for his communist activities, and it was during this time in prison that he first made his elaborations on Juche, and when he got out, he made speeches on the Juche-oriented revolutionary line to several meetings of young communists and anti-imperialist youth. And then in 1931, he began preparations for an actual armed force. And this is where Songun was first asserted, with slogans like at meetings like "oppose arms with arms" and "oppose counter-revolutionary violence with revolutionary violence."
Nice.
And Kim's only asset at this time of his life were the 2 pistols that his father had given him when he set out on the road of revolution. He founded the Anti-Japanese People's Guerrilla Army in 1932. It was later renamed the Korean People's Revolutionary Army. And like his father, he mainly focused on the border areas and Manchuria, constantly evading the Japanese who were chasing them in the forests surrounding the Korea-China border, especially around Mount Paktu and its many forests. And then in 1937, there was the Battle of Ponchonbo, which was a major turning point in the anti-Japanese struggle because the KPRA was outnumbered. They did not have the same intel as the Japanese, and they were able to crush their defenses, and it sent a shockwave through Korean society that armed struggle could work, and it caused many hundreds of people to join the Korean People's Revolutionary Army at that time. And then in 1939, World War II broke out. Minor note. In August 1940, he made speeches to military and political cadres of the Korean People's Revolution Army. This was very historic because it was quite early in the war, and he said that Japan's fall was pretty much inevitable because they had extended their resources way too thin to keep up, and that at that moment he initiated a new campaign to train and bring about national liberation. So there were several battles that I could go into between now and then, but jumping ahead a little bit more, on August 9th of 1945, seeing that the Japanese were on their heels, they were about to surrender, he gave the orders to all units of the Korean People's Revolutionary Army to mobilize for liberation. And those units broke through defenses that were previously deemed impregnable by the Japanese, and within days they were already in Seoul.
So
and these were...
I'm
sorry.
At any point, did the U.S. or the West offer material support to this movement the way that they did to Ho Chi Minh during Japanese occupation?
No, there were not even any lines of communication between the Western powers and the Korean People's Revolution. The Soviets did aid. I was going to note in obviously. When they liberated the country, and there are several monuments throughout the country that thank the fallen Soviet soldiers for what they did for Korea's liberation, which totally flies in the face of this whole myth that gets perpetuated that in the DPRK, all you're told is that Kim Il-sung single-handedly, shot the Japanese aggressors and chased them from the peninsula. They don't say that at all.
Sure. It also dispels the myth, which we don't have the time to talk about, but that the USSR was an imperialist nation.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree. Both countries have a very long internationalist history. That's another thing about Korea. They don't. Everyone says that they never have aided any anti-imperialist struggles in all of their history, and it's just total nonsense. But okay, so the United States sees that the Soviets and the Korean People's Revolutionary Army are quickly advancing down the peninsula, and they are a man by the name of Dean Rusk, Colonel Dean Rusk, specifically. He was pressured by his superiors to, as they were trying to negotiate with the Soviets as to who got what and who was controlling what territory, they told him that he only had a few hours to decide where the line should be, and he only was given a geographical map with the latitudes and longitudes of Korea. No political maps, nothing with the provinces, something like that. And he has testified that when pressed, he literally just grabbed a ruler, put it up against the 38th parallel, and drew a line across Korea.
Wow.
And this was partially because he was pressured because they really wanted to have Seoul. They thought that Seoul, if they had it, even though the Soviets were already in Seoul at the time, that it would give them a dominant position if there was a reunification at all. And so in 1948, the DPRK was finally established after an election for deputies to the First Supreme People's Assembly, which was held in both the North and South. In the North, about almost 100% participated in the election because there was no impeding voters.
Sure.
But in the South, there was very harsh repression of voters and efforts to, because I went a little too far actually. After Japan surrendered, people do not know about this for some reason, but there was a government established on the Korean Peninsula before U.S. forces had ever even stepped a foot onto the peninsula, called the People's Republic of Korea, which lasted for several months. It had some of the same goal, very similar programs to the Workers' Party of Korea, but it was immediately banned by U.S. forces. Its leaders were arrested, and a military commission run by the United States government took its place as administering the South.
Great.
So they did not want this election to be held in the South, so they were actively repressing people who were trying to take part. And it was held underground, completely underground, by thousands of sympathetic units in the South, and 77% participated. It was, I think, a very close. It was a very equitable SPA. I think equal representation of peasantry and intellectuals and things like that. Different sects of Korean society, people from all walks of life, basically.
Wow.
And That session, the first session of the SPA, was held in Pyongyang in September, and then on September 9th, the DPRK was finally proclaimed, and Kim Il-sung was elected premier of the cabinet and the head of the state.
So the People's Republic of Korea, how was that organized, I suppose, in that interim period? Like what I guess what was the structure of it? Did
The thing is that it did
power at all?
Yeah, it did not. It was not very. There was a big power vacuum at the time when Japanese just suddenly left, and a lot of police and things like that had to take over regionally. So it was very short lived, and they did not have enough time to really do anything significant. But it did last, I think, from September to December.
Okay.
Of 1945.
So something else which we learned when we were living in South Korea is that when the Japanese left, like as they were being pushed out off of the Korean peninsula, they burned everything. They set fire to forests, they burned grain, they destroyed buildings. I mean, they completely wrecked the peninsula top to bottom, to the point that like old trees, they will build around them because there are so few of them left in the country. Most of the trees on the, at least, from the point of where the Japanese began to get pushed out, are younger than the end of World War II, which is wild to me. But
so crazy
like
to
they
think
just
about.
like even in the South, Korean people just still despise the Japanese for what they did to that country.
Oh yeah,
for so
overwhelmingly.
long. Yeah, I mean, it's unreal. Like just the terrible conditions that they lived under for so long, and then the way they completely destroyed the country on their way out. Which I wonder sometimes, like, because the U.S. has such a heavy presence in the Republic of Korea, but is also such a strong ally of Japan, like, how that makes the people of Korea feel that, like, you are allied with my enemy.
What is the attitude of the South Koreans, especially revolutionary?
I mean, there so we lived on a bombing range, literally a bombing range, and
Wow.
there was there's a building like right outside the bombing range that just has this giant mural on it that has like an F-16
Wow.
flying up, and then this Korean person, like, with their fist in the air, like yelling at the plane, like basically trying to get rid of the bomb, because who wants to live around a bombing range? Like, honestly, they're like, I don't know. Anyway, like, so I imagine there's enough anger against Americans even within South Korea that it's like,
There's a lot of anger against Americans in South Korea.
yeah,
I mean, they're a polite people, so
They
they're
aren't as
kind-hearted,
hated
yeah.
as the Japanese, but there is a large segment that doesn't like Americans. Yeah.
Sure. And I'm sure it's not even necessarily they don't like Americans. They just rather they not have their entire fucking military centered in South Korea.
And this is after how many hundreds of thousands of communists have been slaughtered in the South, and
Right.
they've been dominated by conservative politics for several generations up until Moon Jae-in, and yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry, didn't mean to derail there.
Oh, you're fine. So the Japanese, they heralded all these things they did for Korea. All these they talked about bringing civilization to Korea, and they talked about all these rails and all these schools and all this infrastructure, and then they just completely demolish it on the way out, intentionally, for no good reason other than they wish harm on the Korean people. So jumping ahead just 2 years, now we're going to get into the Korean War. And one of the biggest misconceptions about the Korean War is who started it and whose intentions it was to start it. And one of the things that we're not really talked about, we're not really told about in the West, really at all, is the Sigmund Rhee and his history. And he had asked, he was the president of South Korea, by the way, from 1948 to 1960. And he had asked the U.S. several times for his backing, for their backing for an invasion to the north. He was constantly asking for arms shipments, which he got on several occasions. The Americans were originally hesitant on trying to attack the North because they didn't want to escalate with China and Russia at that particular moment. And but then days before the war broke, a secret U.S. diplomatic delegation went to South Korea on a special visit. And only 8 days before the war broke out, they made special inspections of the front lines of the DMZ, and they had a secret meeting that was never notified to the press or the public with Sigmund Rhee. Historians aren't really sure what happened, but one of the people who was there, General Lieutenant Cho Duk-shin, later recalled that Dulles, who was a U.S. diplomat there, had assured Rhee that America would always aid those who were fighting against communism, and that they were all very impressed by the readiness of the forces that were at the border during their inspection. The North saw this and saw them when they were doing their inspection of the front lines, and they were on high alert. And then on June 25th, there was a 6-hour shelling of northern defenses at Ongjin, followed by a very brief pause and a wave of attacks that stormed across the 38th parallel, going north. The North counterattacked, and within 3 days they were within Seoul, which when they entered the town, they were met with masses of celebrations and people welcoming them back to Seoul. The U.S. immediately got involved and was sending supplies and soldiers, and they really wanted to use the UN as a guise for a much larger scale intervention into the conflict. And unfortunately, at the time, the Soviets, who could have vetoed the resolution beginning the intervention into Korea, they were protesting the UN, and they were not. They were boycotting it at the time.
Shit.
Yeah. So.
What year was this?
I believe 1950 should be.
Okay. Stalin did something wrong.
Yeah. And what began was the largest U.S. bombing campaign in U.S. history. I'm pretty sure more bombs dropped on Korea than in the entire Pacific theater of World War II.
Yeah.
I think they said it was 18 bombs per square kilometer of the northern half of Korea. A city like Pyongyang, which had over 500,000 people in it, suddenly, a U.S. Air Force reported they only had 2 buildings left standing intact in the entire city. And this is because just in a few months, they had already run out of any viable military targets for targeting from air.
They were just targeting anything and everything.
Exactly, and they immediately began targeting the cities, the towns, infrastructure, everything.
Who was the U.S. general that later on commented on the devastation of what happened in North Korea?
Oh, there are.
I cannot believe what we did. I've never seen anything so
I think it
terrible
was
in my life.
MacArthur.
I think it was MacArthur. Yeah.
And so when they ran out of military targets, they went for everything infrastructure. And it was reported at the U.S. Air Force at the time, later on in the war, that not a single building in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was over 1 story in height because all of them had been bombed to rubble.
Jesus.
The government it was a very desperate time for the people, obviously, and the government even had to, at one time I've read, issue instructions for people to dig, dwellings into the earth, during these troubles.
Didn't they bomb dams in order
Yes,
to...
Yes.
To flood villages downstream, exactly. And they used germ warfare. They tried to spread diseases. They tried to poison water supplies. Anything that they could do to kill more Koreans.
The U.S. is trash.
Yeah, and so with the help of the Chinese, the Korean War, I could go on forever and ever. There's so many atrocities and massacres. I've read about New York Times reporters and their stories of they go into these villages that were being defended by the Chinese, but they just retook them after bombing. And just walking into these villages, child's bodies strewn everywhere, schoolyards just filled with children's bodies, courtyards filled with people, confused older women hanging up clothes amid the charred remains of their, families. And it was just an awful place to be, and it was a total misery for the Korean people during the war. And they've kept alive the stories and these kind of feelings very well. In the north, many posters you can see with, not exaggerating at all, seeing the children above the corpses of their dead mothers crying. Just very heartbreaking stuff. But the DPRK eventually did force the U.S. into an armistice on July the 27th, 1953. And Clark, who was the commander of the UN forces, later commented that he had the distinctly unenviable honor of being the only U.S. commander to sign an armistice without a victory. So this was a massive achievement for the Korean people that has been and always will be considered one of the greatest triumphs of anti-imperialist struggle. And to this day, it's called the July 27th is the Day of Victory in the Fatherland Liberation War.
Nice.
And so, obviously, with that, the end of the war began the DMZ, I guess as we know it today, the front line. It has a 240-mile wall on the south front of the DMZ, although now they're considering maybe getting rid of it, which is incredible.
Right.
So, okay, Reconstruction. I don't have a lot about this, but I have a little bit. Obviously, okay, so there are no factories in the north after this war. They're all gone. They can't make bricks. They can't make cement. They can't make anything. Thankfully, there were a lot of international forces that also helped Korea during this time. Notably, People's China, the USSR, the GDR sent hundreds of engineers, and they began immediately restructuring towns and villages and enterprises and factories. And the first 3-year plan for post-war rehabilitation of their national economy ended up being overfilled by 22%. And then by 1957, industrial production was rising at 44% a year. 1957, rising by 37%. And so basically, Korea, which was once a formerly a colonial agrarian state, which was so far removed from modern technology, was very quickly transformed into a modern socialist industrial state. They were suddenly building 1,000 local factories a year. They were finally being able to reconstruct their infrastructure, highways, bridges, airports.
Right, but socialism doesn't work.
Yeah.
But it's amazing though, like if you look at like the ways in which the West, and particularly now the United States, quote unquote, develops nations, it's highly extractive. Like they go in and they're like, hey, we'll give you a loan for you to build this infrastructure. If you fuck it up, though, you now have to open your borders to us, and you have to give us X amount of your tax money, and you have to cut social programs. And so even though maybe they're getting like, oh, I've now got an electric power plant that allows me to develop industry, that industry is probably going to end up being a foreign company that jumps in there and extracts your resources and your money and ships the products back to the global north or the west or whatever, versus this sort of infrastructure building where it's a matter of solidarity and internationalism, and it's largely what China is doing in Africa right now. And I don't want to get into that fucking like hornet's nest at this point, but like to call what they're doing in Africa imperialism is like, it's sketch. If you it's not perfect, I'm gonna say that, but like they are developing infrastructure with grants, with no interest loans. They're bringing in all sorts of technology and just giving it to people. They are extracting to some degree, so I suppose if you're like really gonna get down to it and you want to call that imperialism, I guess you're going to fucking do it. But the reality is that it's very different from US or IMF or World Bank imperialism. It's very, very different. So
Yeah.
anyway.
I've heard, I recently heard in reference to, I think it was $60 billion in interest-free
Yes.
loans to Africa.
Yeah. You think
That's
the IMF
Chinese
is gonna do that
colonialism
shit?
or something.
Yeah, fucking get out of here. Get out of here. Anyway, sorry, Natalie.
It's fine. Yeah, so suddenly they're able to domestically manufacture 10,000-ton presses, heavy-duty trucks, tractors, diesel engines, ships, industrial machines, all by themselves from start to finish. And so basically, both Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il built Korea they brought it to the 20th century, got rid of the feudal society. They brought in agrarian reform. It was the first time in Korean society that women had equal social and political status. And they immediately also nationalized industry, transport, communications, banks, things like that. Okay, jumping forward also a little bit more, here are the 80s and early 90s. Obviously, this time is kind of marked with the fall of the USSR and other socialist countries. It felt at the time, I'm sure, like it was very interconnected, simultaneous, a very short period of time, and the DPRK was paying very much attention to what was going on, and they noted that during this time period there were several major geopolitical victories for the foreign policy of George H.W. Bush, and almost all of it was done without firing a shot.
Right.
And then in 1991, Bush gave his State of the Union, the New World Order won. The last of socialism is going. The future is dominated by capitalism. Blah blah blah. And the DPRK really sees this collapse in the 80s and early 90s as orchestrated by those who were pushing a peaceful transition from socialism back to capitalism. From within the socialist movement, they think that they were opportunists and traitors, and many of the people that were pushing this narrative were U.S. officials, corrupt international elements, and many labor movements acted also in concert with these ideas from their perspective. They thought that the new way of thinking advocated by Gorbachev of that time was, the specific quote was, they called him a Judas of the 20th century. And that his ideas were a, quote, Trojan horse.
Also
and
true.
And that it was used by the West to penetrate and destroy socialist movements. And then Kim Il-sung died in 1994, which was one of the greatest losses in all of Korean history, and one of the most people in the North and South were hysterical over his death, and there's still millions of people who wish for the days of Kim Il-sung back. But the U.S. saw this as a really great opportunity, as they thought that immediately after the death of Kim Il-sung, that Kim Jong-il would not last if he were to take over the reins of his father, and that he could not keep up this popular support that his father enjoyed. Most people, one of the ways that I've heard Koreans themselves describe it is that Kim Il-sung was, to them, similar to a Nelson Mandela or a Martin Luther King, a figure like that, someone whose history and family history was so intertied and interconnected with the struggle and plight of Korean people, and with his family being so involved in the history of resistance. It was, at the time, it was like, for them, I'm sure, as if the world was coming to an end, and that maybe their system could fall as well. But this was followed by very tragic events after his passing. In fall of 1995, there was severe torrential rains, which flooded and destroyed vast portions of their crops. So they went from producing 3 million tons of rice a year to 1 million tons, and 4 million tons of corn a year to 1 million tons in the span of 1 year. So it wasn't like, for some reason, some people seem to think, oh, it was this long-standing economic mismanagement. It was coming. It was very sudden, and it was due to not only the collapse of the Soviet Union, but terrible natural disasters at home.
It's the same. That was the same line that was employed with the Soviet famine as well.
Yeah. So at the beginning of the early 1990s is when the nuclear issue came about as well. And in 1994, one of the most important things that I try to talk about when I try to explain Korean history is the agreed framework of 1994 between North and South Korea and the United States. And the DPRK had a plutonium enrichment program at one point. This was halted because they had finally come to an agreement with the United States that in exchange for the easing of sanctions, about 500,000 tons of fuel, and for 2 proliferation-proof commercial light water nuclear reactors, they would completely halt their nuclear program with verification by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And this lasted for about 9 years. But the DPRK did not enrich or create any fissile material from 1991 to 2003. And along with this agreement, the North and South agreed to move rapidly towards full diplomatic and economic normalization. But this all came to a close with the election of George H.W. Bush, who used early 90s intelligence that was later proven false to claim that the North, all of its nuclear facilities were actually underground where we can't see them, and they're, magically producing nuclear weapons.
We know that they're making nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Because
the U.S. doesn't want to trust us.
At the very same time, they were releasing bullshit photos of, look at Osama bin Laden's vast underground complex. Never existed at all. Never. And even though that the DPRK was consistent with the agreement, it was confirmed by the IAEA, and the U.S. State Department in 1998 testified to Congress that no violations had been committed at all. They halted and slowed down fuel shipments, which was a big part of the reason why the deal was so important. And the DPRK was patient enough to wait through the entire duration of the agreement for those 2 light water reactors. They were supposed to be built by a consortium of U.S., South Korean, and Japanese companies that would build it for them. But that never happened either. It went to bidding, and it never got past that before the agreement just collapsed. So then the DPRK withdrew from the NPT in 2003. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, And they also did several nuclear tests afterwards, I think 2005, 2006, and 2013, and then one in 2016, being the Hwasong 15 intercontinental ballistic missile. Obviously, then in December 2011, Kim Jong-il passed, and a few months, I think it was actually a year or so later, that Kim Jong-un assumed a role with similar powers, though the offices are not the same. President Kim Il-sung, after he died, they got rid of the office and any official function, and he remains the eternal president of Korea. And after Kim Jong-il passed, the position of General Secretary was also abolished, and he is the eternal holder of that spot. So that's kind of gives a small idea of where we are today. I tried.
You did great, actually. Would you mind, or are you, I guess, familiar enough to give us a rundown of what the Juche idea is? Like what it
I can try. I'm not really good at the philosophy, I admit. But basically, Juche is...
I know self-reliance is like a huge part of it,
yeah,
which is why,
exactly.
like, as far as like communist ideas that would work well in the United States, Juche ironically would be one of the better ones.
A lot of the things that I've read that are, a Juche is, one of the things that I have trouble with it is that it's all theory and it's no practice. There's very few examples of Juche in practice, and that's because Juche, it says that all the people of the world should independently create their revolutions, and that they should play to their strengths, and that their revolution should reflect their culture and their history, rather than blindly follow the examples of Russia or China or so forth. They like in Korea they have Korean style socialism, not necessarily Soviet style, which some people call it.
Kind of an extension of dialectical materialism, right?
Right. I feel like that's the most dialectical thing to do, is like you approach whatever your situation is with the best form of socialism that works for the particular conditions that you're under. So yeah, I like it.
Do you want to talk about, just real quick, talk about modern day, and then we'll kind of address some of the fantastical
mystical bullshit?
Yeah.
Sure. I have a few things I can talk about.
Do it.
For instance, human rights, for instance. In the DPRK today, there's a 7-hour workday. Child labor has been long abolished. Equal employment for women, but there are special protections for them, giving them preferential jobs. Like, for instance, I think that most silk mills are operated mostly by women. Although also a lot of women work in mines, like coal mines often. Income tax is not a thing in the DPRK. It was abolished in 1974. There's free universal education, compulsory 11-year education. You can, a service into the military is not voluntary, but you can be diverted from your service into university instead, which I'll get to that in a minute. But they also have free universal health care. Actually, before liberation, there was not a hospital in the entire northern half of the country.
Wow.
And the Workers' Party of Korea established central hospitals, municipal hospitals, district hospitals, people's hospitals, and clinics. I think there are 12,000 clinics across the DPRK that they founded.
Sounds very impressive.
Yeah, they have many medical universities in the DPRK, so they have a much higher rate of physicians than even in the United States.
Yeah.
And so that's why even a developing nation that's under so much international pressure, they have a higher life expectancy today than Russia, than India, than Indonesia, other countries in the region. It is a couple years lower than the South, but it's a different story for them.
Sure.
Their paid leave is a given for all factory and office jobs in the DPRK, and those who work in dangerous conditions, like in mines, they get extra time off.
Yeah. I was reading this, like, just sort of as research before we came on this episode. I was reading there were a handful of Australian university students who went with a professor to the DPRK to sort of evaluate, not through like because they talk about in this paper that this guy wrote about how if you go as a tourist, it's a lot more controlled where you go and what you see and who you get to talk to or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But this person is like, we were seen as like a cultural exchange sort of situation, and so we were given a little bit more free reign.
Yes,
and he said that like there were 3 separate nights where they went out without a guide, without somebody following them, without like making sure they were like going to the right places or seeing the right things. Anyway, this student was talking about how people who work in mines, people who are engineers, people who are school teachers, scientists, these are the highest paid people in the DPRK. It's not the bureaucrats,
Mm-hmm.
so this very much mirrors the Soviet Union. The highest paid people are artists, are artisans, are coal miners, are whatever. But also like coal miners, people who do physical labor like that, are given preferential treatment. Not just they get paid more and they get more time off, but they also get like, if there's like a whatever vacation resort and there's limited numbers of spots, they are given preferential treatment to go and do these things, and they are given like priority seating and restaurants and stuff like that.
Yeah, they get like free tickets to go get meals at restaurants and things like that.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a totally different way of looking at like, it's not a matter of like, oh well, my daddy worked his way up to the top and therefore I get all of the shit. It's like who is contributing to the functioning of this society in a meaningful way, and how can we reward those people?
Yeah, even street cleaners, they look up to people like that who they see the value in what they're doing for their society. And you're completely right about who you go with. For tourists and delegations are two different worlds of seeing the DPRK.
Right.
I don't know if you guys saw there was a military parade just a couple days ago. I had friends who were there, several friends, and one was a tourist and one was a comrade named Dr. Dermot Hudson, and the tourist was out on the streets for the parade, waving to the trucks of soldiers go by after the parade when they're going through the streets, and they're seeing all the people and everyone's waving and waving bouquets and flags and things like that. And the delegation was able to sit in the stands next to the tribune of the Kim Il Sung Square, and were able to see and applaud for Comrade Kim Jong-un.
Nice.
So it's just they treat you as friends if you're part of a cultural exchange or delegation or something like that. With tourists, it's a little less so. Yeah. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have written down for my spiel.
Cool.
So, do you want to kind of address, I guess, just real quickly, because any revolutionary socialist should know that all of it's bullshit, but let's go ahead and talk about a couple of the major like unicorn style.
Oh god.
I can't. I love this. I love this.
Yeah. So a good place to
Alright.
start would probably be the prisons.
Yeah, so let's talk about how like 70 gajillion people are imprisoned
Yeah.
in the DPRK.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I want to know that if the numbers that the West puts out are if they were even 10% accurate, the death rate of these camps would be so far outpacing the birth rate of Korea. There would have been nobody left 20 years ago.
Yeah.
They're claiming some of these camps that I looked them up on Google, and you can see they're just like, they look identical to all these other little small farming villages in the mountains, and they say, oh, this is where 120,000 people are being kept. Okay.
Right, and I know like the fucking CIA can zoom in on our house right now and watch us recording this podcast, but somehow can't get like a good picture of the like million people gulags in North Korea. So Jeremy, he's shaved his head. I've heard that Kim Jong-un requires all men to have the same haircut that he does.
Yeah.
I've also heard that he has banned anybody else from having the same haircut. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Same
That's
time.
how it works. I had a comrade that went to the DPRK, and they actually they went to the Munsu Water Park, which is it's a beautiful, famous water park in Pyongyang. But they have a barber there, and they went in there and they were talking to some of the salon girls, and there was a poster of these are the only haircuts you can have in socialist lifestyle, and he asked her what these were for, and he told her about how are these the state sanctioned haircuts, and she looked at him super confused and said that that's just a chart to help people decide if they don't know what they want.
That's how it is in American barbershops.
Yeah, they have them in our
and
fucking
it's like,
barbershops.
here's some series of hairstyles. Point at the one that you like, and we'll cut your hair. Like, that's fucking.
And
stupid.
if you pay attention to those articles, it'll change every couple of years based on what poster they have a new picture of. They'll suddenly say, the state you're only allowed to have 16, and then it's 22, and then it's 28. It just varies by whatever poster they're looking at in a fucking barbershop. But yeah.
It was so. What about the fun? Like, wasn't his uncle shot by an anti-aircraft gun and then showed up in a meeting 6 months later?
There are so many officials that they claim have been shot by anti-aircraft guns. It's a repeating thing in these stories. I don't know if it's like what South Korean tabloid is pushing them, but they have a thing for it. And they also said Jang Song Tech, who they very transparently showed on national television the arrest of Jang Song Tech from the Supreme People's Assembly. He was pulled by soldiers and let out of the room. And they showed it on live television, and they didn't have to, but suddenly they say that he was pulled apart by a starving pack of dogs that they just keep around for those purposes.
Of course, yeah. I have a pack of those as well.
And then they claimed that what they claim was that one of Kim Jong Un's former girlfriends was executed along with an entire band, an orchestra of people, because she had produced a pornographic videotape. And you can literally go on YouTube and look it up, like DPRK, I don't know, sex tape, something like that. And it's just a song, a performance of a song in the DPRK. And it's like, it's in a kind of Western style, because DPRK does do covers of Western songs sometimes. And they claimed, they got all executed because this dance is considered pornography. And then about a year later, she was leading the DPRK delegation to South Korea ahead of the Olympics.
Right. I mean,
So,
you can't, and there's so many times, it's verifiable. All of these defectors who cross the border, not all of them, a lot of the defectors who cross the border, their story changes over and over and over, and it's because they're being paid for their story. They're getting $80,000 or $120,000 to make their story as salacious as possible, to stir up anti-DPRK sentiment. But there is one defector who came across to the Republic of Korea, and she was shocked at the amount of homelessness in Seoul. She was appalled at the fact that there was so much homelessness and so much poverty which existed in a place with so much wealth. And it's non-existent in the DPRK. I mean, there's none of this.
Homelessness does not exist in the DPRK, period.
Exactly. And and this comes back to a lot of what does freedom mean and what does liberty mean? You can't if you have to struggle to survive, if you can't meet your basic needs even if you're working full time, what kind of fucking freedom is that? I don't give a shit. If you have no choice but to work for this capitalist asshole or that capitalist asshole for not enough money to live and to thrive and to feel comfortable in your life, I don't give a shit how much freedom of speech you have or whether there's quote unquote freedom of the press. I don't care about any of that. If your basic needs are not being met, you are not free. So whatever.
Yeah, they hear these stories about wealth and equality in the South from people who either are South Korean intelligence agents or directly work with South Korean intelligence agents. Most people that are taking defectors across are working with intelligence. And when they get there, they become so disenchanted with South Korean society because they're oftentimes, if they don't sell out for these massive amount of money, they often are homeless. They often are on the outskirts.
And they want to go back.
Yeah, many want to go back. Many want to go back, and the South Koreans will not allow it.
Right. Yeah, but whatever, authoritarianism.
Yeah, and you're right about them just changing their stories all the time. I mean, one of the biggest that comes to my mind, I see her constantly, and her face just makes me so mad.
Yes.
Parking on me.
Yes. She's the worst. I mean, absolutely the worst.
I think she said at one point that she had to bury her own father by herself. Yeah. She had to dig the hole for her father, and then in another story she claimed that he never even came with them to China. And
there was one point I think where she says that her mother died in the journey. And then and then there's another version where she says her mother died in what amounted to a concentration camp in the
I've heard other ones where she says that her mother was with her in China and she had to become a prostitute to support her.
Yeah, the story is different every time she tells it, and somehow people are like, yeah, I'll buy that. because
I
that's
think
what they
people
want
don't
to
look
hear.
into it. Yeah,
It's because that's what they want to hear. They've been told their whole lives that the
Yeah.
DPRK is a horrible place and it's terrible, and you know, it is Orientalism in the purest form. Like, you are looking at these people and you're infantilizing them, and you are you know, making them into this, like, oh these Oriental despots, you know. Like, it's a way in which imperialists are able to work their own people up into a fervor, so that they can then justify war. And, you know, I don't give a shit who these people are. They're not a threat to the United States. You know, this is not something that's like, we are in imminent danger and we must lash out. It is purely a matter of, we do not want these people to have the economic system they have. We want to be able to extract as many resources from them as we can. And so in order to do that, we're going to make up a bunch of bullshit about them and make it seem like we're freeing them, like we did in Iraq, like we did in Afghanistan, like we did in Kosovo, like we did in Vietnam.
It's
like
crazy
we did,
to me
that
it's crazy to me that the same U.S. population that can accept and knows, even like fucking conservatives know that it was a lie that brought us into the Vietnam War, and it was a lie that brought us into the Iraq War, and a dozen other lies that every American knows that the American State Department has told them. But it's still like, oh no, but this one's real. This one is
true.
This one's legit. Yeah. It's wild.
yeah. It really reminds me of I forget her full name, but like Banna with Syria. She like, please, Mr. Trump, please come bomb Syria. And then I think about them during that congressional testimony for the build up to the Gulf War, bringing teenagers out to talk about how Saddam threw the Kuwaiti babies out of the incubators and shit like that. Just people who they're the same, from the same nationalities, so we just have to believe these.
My favorite one of these is there was a girl, a teenage girl, in Syria, who was like, I'm gay and I am so afraid for my life. Bashar al-Assad is going to come and kill me for who I am as a person. And then it turned out that it was a middle-aged white Scottish dude who had created this persona, who was bouncing like his IP address off of an address in Syria so that he could pretend he was in Syria.
Wow.
Made up this whole thing. Like, you don't even have to be part of the government or of like the Western like intelligentsia or like power elite. You just have to buy that bullshit super hard, and then you become part of the lie. Like, that's so wild to me that somebody would go to that length to encourage imperialist war. It's so wild to me. Like, I do not understand that at all.
Yeah, I mean, and there are even people who I've seen who pretend to be living in the DPRK and that are active online and trying to spread propaganda and things like that too. It's just the same exact strategy over and over again, just repeated, and we're seeing the exact same results.
Yeah.
So what about the myth? Oh, potential myth.
Allegedly.
I don't actually know. Yeah. That people are in prison for 3 generations.
Oh boy.
Oh yes. I think that this myth actually has origins in Chinese history, and so that they just decide to take it over eventually. I think hundreds and hundreds of years ago there was some harsh punishment in China, wherein 3 generations of, I think it was actually Mongolian, somewhere in that region of the world, and that they had 3 generations punishment. But okay, so we have to believe that almost upwards of 500,000 people are in these camps, these concentration camps, and that even the most slightest crime will just get you and your entire family, your cousins, your whole extended family, your lineage, rounded up and tossed into a labor camp or a concentration camp, extermination camp, whatever they want to call it. The entire country would be, in prison. Like,
Yeah.
500,000 people, all their families, all their relatives, that would be everybody.
Yeah.
It's just, it's
What
blatantly
is the
false.
population of the DPRK?
I think 25 million, 24.
So 5 million people were locked up. You're talking about like a fifth of the population.
Yeah, it would just be ridiculous.
Might kind of crush the entire economy if you lost
If you
a fifth of your people.
the DPRK is super magnanimous in its judicial system. Every 5 and 10 years, they do mass amnesties for people who have committed crimes against the state, and thousands of people get released.
I was just going to ask about the artwork, because recently I looked on Twitter. There was like this mural like for the bus stops, and I was just wondering if you could speak on like the motifs that you find within their work, and then how
so there's a lot of artwork in the DPRK. Socialist realism has been very dominant there for decades. Some of the most beautiful artwork that I've ever seen personally. They do not. You're not going to see any corporate advertising in the DPRK. I think I've seen maybe 2 billboards for cars that are made by and for the state. But beyond that, I've never seen any kind of corporate advertising. At bus stops in particular, they don't use. You're not going to see ads and nonsense like that. They use, beautiful flowers and mountains and nature and things like that to decorate. There are countless murals across the country. Some of them depict working people in very grandiose situations and overcoming and class struggle and all these things. And then some others are the revolutionary history of the leaders, and if they made like a particular important visit to a factory, often they'll erect a mural outside of it, and things like that. And there are lots of,
like, in case anybody doesn't know, like the symbol of like the DPRK kind of equivalent of the hammer and sickle. It's a hammer on one side, a scythe on another side, and then in the middle is a paintbrush, which is fucking rad. Like,
yeah,
that's cool as hell.
It stands for the workers, peasants, and intellectuals. Yes.
I think it's beautiful.
So I have another question. What are the dynamics of like gender roles in the DPRK, and additionally, like, how are LGBTQ plus people seen in the DPRK?
Great question. So Korean DPRK, it is a somewhat socially conservative society. As far as LGBT rights, I'll get into that in just a moment. But women do hold, again, equal political and social status. They are elected and to various bodies, from the county and provincial level to Supreme People's Assembly. And obviously now we're seeing a lot more women in the forefront, especially with very great actors like Kim Yo-jong, who is vice director of the Central Committee of the Workers' Party. On LGBT rights, before I go back to that, there's a lot of confusion about this issue because there's not a lot published about it by the DPRK, and I noticed that a lot of people will take one statement and one statement or one action and try to say, oh, well, this is the official policy, this is where they stand, when they haven't really talked about it much. It's not a politicized issue in the DPRK like it is in the United States because, at least the way I see it is, they don't have a media which just 24/7 is inundating, the public with anti-LGBT propaganda, telling them that, for instance, something that I hear all the time is, trans people are coming for your children. Trans people are into children. That's what they're trying to convert people.
Right, yeah, trans people just want to watch your children pee.
Yeah, exactly. And and I have many trans friends who have been to the DPRK, and they've received nothing but warmth and understanding. They don't really get the concept of it. They're a little old fashioned, and there's not much education going on about these things, which could change in the future, but who knows. but so same-sex marriage is not allowed, not legal in the DPRK. It is, however, not uncommon for male and female same-sex partners to live in the same houses, live together for their whole lives, receive the same benefits from the party, and but they can't. Their marriage is not legally recognized. There's a big societal difference as far as perceptions of femininity and masculinity. It's not uncommon if you're walking down the streets of Pyongyang to see, two male soldiers embracing, or, to kiss one another on the cheek or something like that. And it's very common sight to see, women soldiers and women of all walks of life embracing, hugging, holding hands, walking down the street, kissing one another, etc., things like that. So I guess things that we would consider, I guess some people would call them, I don't know, oh, that's gay as hell, bro. It's just normal life in the DPRK. But there definitely is not any discrimination against LGBT people. I don't know where this myth about constantly all day long, all I get is, oh, if you were in DPRK, you'd be in a concentration camp because you're trans. And I've read so much on the DPRK, and I've never once even seen the word, transgender, LGBT, nothing like that in a DPRK book. But apparently these people know that, who is going into these camps and for what reasons, right. And we know everything, and they don't, and we never listen to anybody really.
True.
And that goes way further. I mean, if you go to the South, it's not a radical idea like it is here to support the DPRK or support or have solidarity with them or want Korean reunification. It's even a center left position in South Korea. Moon Jae-in was pretty sympathetic to the DPRK and is in some of his earlier years. So yeah, sorry.
That is
okay. But
like,
yeah,
I thought they would be. I thought the South were raised to be vehemently against.
Well, okay, so there's a concept in Korean culture called Han, which is it's difficult to explain, but it's sort of a cultural sadness. It's like they are brokenhearted, one because of the centuries of oppression, primarily by the Japanese, but then also the fact that they're sort of broken in half with the South and the North. And so they have this concept of like a cultural depression almost that they call Han. And I don't know that there's really like an equivalent in the Western world. I mean, maybe like Ireland as like being oppressed by the English and then now being divided into, Northern Ireland and the Republic. But really like that's I think it ties the DPRK and the Republic of Korea together in some ways, because I think both sides, I mean, they've got family in the North, they got family in the South that they never get to see. And I think at least peripherally, everyone in the South is probably aware that it's largely because of the United States. Even if they're not like fully like, yeah, I understand. A lot of them do though. A lot of them are fully aware that it's the US that keeps the North and the South apart from each other. So, I mean, yeah, they probably are bombarded with anti-North propaganda all the time, but like that, it's hard to overcome cultural bonds. It's difficult to overcome family bonds. So I don't think that bullshit like flies 100% in the South even.
Like I said, we spent a year in the South, and at no point in that year was it ever brought up of like the brutality of the North. Like that was never a subject that was brought up with the Korean people. And we living on this bombing range as we laid out, as you can imagine, a bombing range doesn't have very many people on it.
Yeah.
It's just a skeleton crew basically to run it.
Yeah. There were 15 U.S. soldiers, or airmen, I guess.
Yeah.
And then 60 something Korean.
Yep.
nationals.
So I think it was like 60 Korean. So basically, we didn't spend a lot of time around other Americans, so we spent a lot of time around other Koreans. And certainly they didn't, they weren't like outspoken about the brutality of the American military because, they were employed by the American military. But also was it was never brought up that, about this brutality of the North. So
the brutality of Japan was occasionally brought up.
Yeah, that's true. So, just something to, I guess, to throw out there.
I think part of that is because the South has experienced genuine oppression from their own government. I mean, the Bodo League massacre, I think 300,000 suspected communists were rounded up in the South and basically shot into mass graves. People in the streets protesting for democracy and basic human rights being run over by tanks and beaten in the streets by riot police. I mean, the South literally, and they have museums that you can go to now to see them. There were so many concentration camps in the South where often students would just disappear and you'd wonder where they were and you would never see them again. And they were taken in trucks and just basically taken to these horrible camps that thousands of people died in. So I think they're not quick to judge, especially with claims as dubious as these. And the vast majority of the South Korean people see the North not as an enemy, and polls have shown this consistently, that they're not an enemy, that they are a partner that they want to work with, and that they want reunification.
If you haven't seen the movie Train to Busan, it's a zombie movie, but it's got heavy, very thinly veiled political messages. There's a point at which the train comes to it gets whatever. I don't want to give too much away, but they get to like this train station where there's like multiple tracks or whatever, and the whole point of the movie is they're trying to get to the mountains in the north. Never says North Korea, but they're trying to get to the mountains in the north. And at one point, the train gets derailed, and so they're like, "We've got to keep going. We've got to keep going on this track." And they're like, "Take the far left track. Get on the far left track." And I'm like, this is suspicious. But it's still like, this is South Korea is not just a puppet of the United States. At least not amongst its general population, even if the government is.
Yeah, and certainly the military is.
Yeah, for sure the military is.
So Natalie, what is the government structure in North Korea? Sorry to.
We're gonna
ask an extended question, just real quick, but is it like a dictatorship? Is it?
I mean, okay, so in the economy, there are two different kinds of ownership. There's all people ownership, and then there's cooperative ownership. And all people ownership are the means of production that are owned by all the people, and those are usually completely overseen by the state, the central state. But the dominant system is basically the cooperative, which is basically that the means of production are owned and controlled by a certain collective. Especially, this is how it works in the rural economy where the party can't as effectively manage.
Agriculture is definitely like worker-owned cooperatives, basically, or worker-controlled anyway, not necessarily owned.
But the DPRK is definitely not a dictatorship. They hold elections for local people's assemblies every 5 years, I believe, and SPA every 4 years. I could get those mixed up, but they do have county, provincial, and city assemblies, people's assemblies, that work in conjunction with the Supreme People's Assembly, which is the national legislature. But all of their candidates are selected through during mass meetings. They have to be approved by the public. And for some reason, people think that oh, you just show up to the polls and you only have one choice. Oh, that's it. No, you chose. You all came to a
unlike the
consensus
U.S.
about
where you have two options that are essentially the same choice.
But the vote is to either accept or reject the decision that all the people came to together as one. So that's why you suddenly have 99.97% approval. It's because it was done through hours and hours and hours of consensus building, and these meetings are you don't have to inconvenience yourself and go to some big meeting hall. Sometimes they are held there in towns, but they're often held in people's workplaces, because in workplaces they have party secretaries that manage all the political activities and make sure that the workers have a rich political and cultural life.
That's amazing. 99.7% consensus.
I mean, that's just an example, but it's usually somewhere that high. Turnout is usually very high in the
really?
DPRK.
I mean, like, the fact is that, like, it doesn't fucking matter if you got one party or two parties or 17.
And there are multiple parties.
Like
There's the Workers' Party, there's the Korean Social Democratic Party, and there's the Chondoist Chongu Party. But they are part of the same. They are part of a ruling coalition, but they have very distinct ideas and who makes up those parties. For instance, the Chondoists it's a religious minority party, but they have I think 22 seats in the Supreme People's Assembly.
But so real quick before we move on and wrap this up, so as far as like your project is concerned, your project that you're launching moving forward,
newsletter, yeah,
right? So if I am just like a regular person who has feels solidarity towards the DPRK, what am I gonna read or find in this project?
Okay, so granted, I'm not done with it yet. I'm still working on our very first issue.
No, sure.
But I wanted to, because there are no publications right now that I'm aware of that are about the DPRK, and that come at it from a perspective of solidarity and anti-imperialism. So those are first and foremost
non-misinformation.
Yeah, exactly. First of all, there's going to be DPRK news. I want to I thought about trying to model it be around the kind of format that they do in the North newspapers, but it's going to contain a lot of DPRK news that's going on that not with like KCNA text or anything. Things that are written by me. Sure. I also want to include a lot of things that can help people strategize and come up with new ways to convince their comrades and things like that. I also wanted to include with it occasionally like little arts and crafts creations, DPRK themed arts and crafts, posters,
Awesome.
things like that.
Great.
But yeah, so that's kind of my idea. It's still a rough idea that I have a month and a half to work out, but yeah.
And what do you know what it's going to be called, or?
It's Korea is one. Korea is one.
Korea is one. Cool.
Yes.
So the next segment that we're going to move on to is it's called Seeing Red, which for those listening for the first time, basically it's where I find posts that are going to hurt everyone's feelings. Nobody else has read these except me, so I've had my feelings hurt first. And
we're gonna extract the truest proletariat rage.
It's basically like you find the hottest of hot takes, the nuclear takes, so to speak, on a particular subject, and then everybody else groans and gets angry as I read them. So these two comments come from the comment section of the Washington Post in an article on Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un meeting and like, never underestimate liberals. Like, they will totally, like, if Donald Trump happens to like drunkenly fall into the correct line, they will fight him just because it's Donald Trump. So anyway, so this is coming from Off the Fox Deep End is the the commenter. That's the name. That's the commenter. So first they quote a section of the article, and it goes, "Last week, Kim reportedly told a team of South Korean envoys that he continued to trust Trump." End quote. So now we're getting into the comment of off the Fox Deep End. "This statement alone should tell you everything we need to know about Donald J. Trump. When a brutal, murderous thug and dictator considers the President of the United States his BFF, and the President of the United States reciprocates that, then America is way past the limit of normalcy. It is obvious that Trump is envious of Kim's absolute control of all levers of power in North Korea. Trump has wet dreams of being crowned as the Imperial Trump, just waiting for that massive military parade known otherwise as the Trump Glory and Adoration Parade. That Trump wants. You can just bet that military units, on order from the Commander-in-Chief, are practicing goose-stepping."
No!
So,
what blows my mind is that these are real humans.
yeah, no,
it's not like some like bot troll or something.
It might be. Who the fuck knows?
I've had the misfortune of meeting several liberals who genuinely believe that Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin have been plotting this whole thing out, and they interfered in the election, and yeah.
It's because this whole fucking idea that Russia is somehow communist because Vladimir Putin is a oligarch
KGB.
who is an ex-KGB agent, and therefore somehow authority equals communism. Nobody fucking knows.
60 years of Cold War runs deep.
Only in America can they claim that a billionaire oligarch is a communist.
Yep.
Right. Fuck
yeah,
off.
yeah, and that's what we brought up with the episode we did with the left media folks when we did
the death of Stalin.
People talk about Stalin was enriching himself.
Yeah.
He shared an apartment with Molotov.
Right.
You know
Shared an apartment. Didn't even have his own apartment. He shared an apartment with Molotov.
Yeah.
The fuck out of here.
Next
All right,
question.
so here we go. Last of the Seeing Red. From the same comment section. How familiar... hang on. This is from CMC... KEONJR. I don't know what the hell that is. I think it's C. McEwen Jr. is what that is.
An intellectual.
An intellectual. And definitely an intellectual. How familiar the modus operandi of North Korea to gain benefit through a feigning of cooperation only to dredge up imagined offenses portrayed in most dramatic language as justification for withdrawal of cooperation after having gotten what it wanted. Like the fucking power plants it never received? Fuck off. Many readers recognize that Kim Jong-un has played America's president for a sucker. The American president's claim that there is no longer a nuclear threat from North Korea, Donald J. Trump, 2018. He cited Donald J. Trump. Is obviously untrue. Reference. Donald J. Trump just landed a long trip, but everybody can now feel much safer than the day I took office. There is no longer a nuclear threat from North Korea. Meeting with Kim Jong-un was an interesting and very positive experience. North Korea, great potential for the future. Probably thumbs up.
Stop.
Donald J. Trump. Tremendous. Just big. Just a really big security risk. So it's wild. It's just so fucking wild to me that you get one little inch of I'm gonna not immediately bomb North Korea, and the liberals are like, why the fuck are you not bombing North Korea?
It's been insane.
So ridiculous.
Watching them go from, oh my god, he's a madman, he's gonna destroy the world, nuclear weapons, to okay, let's maybe not do that. and they just totally went a 180 on us, and now they're pushing the pro-war agenda, of course.
Yeah.
Should have all seen it coming.
No, of course. I mean, and even
because they've got no fucking principles. They got none.
Yes.
No. And from the other perspective, so I told our parents are essentially reactionaries, and I told my parents the last time they were here, I had an argument with them about the DPRK, and I told them if Trump can somehow remove the military from Korea and allow Korea to be unified, I will give all of my support to Donald Trump. and this was back when he was when he had just finished his thing where he was like, oh yeah, everything's going great, yeah. And and so I was like, I will give all of my support to Donald Trump, and they were like, well, you just wait and see. And then literally all he did was walk back everything he said. And surprisingly, shockingly take the U.S. State Department line.
Yeah, it's very weird watching Trump because during the campaign he even talked about the possibility of totally withdrawing from South Korea, and I thought that was a fantastic idea.
Yeah.
One of his only ideas, and very suddenly he was in fire and fury territory, and now he's sending nice little notes on Twitter to Kim, and it's very weird. Trump is very inconsistent.
It's almost like he stands for nothing.
Yeah, weird.
People who are Donald Trump is a fascist. He's going to lead us to fascism. The man is ideologically bankrupt, 100%. He was a fucking Democrat in the late 90s and the early 2000s. He has absolutely no political ideology whatsoever. He has the power for sure, and he has the money, and he sits in that class, but he has absolutely no fucking ideological purity, and therefore no it's not he's not going to take over and be I'm Mussolini now, because he has no idea what the fuck principles are at all. So I guess any final remarks, Natalie, after all that sadness that we just read?
I have nothing to add. I thank you guys so much for having me. I had such a great time.
Always.
I would love to come back and talk some more with you guys.
Thank you so much for being here. So informative. Learned a lot of things that I didn't know. I think that's one of the things I love about this podcast is I learn new things.
Yeah.
It's great to be hey, I'm the subject matter expert, and I'm going to talk about the German Revolution. But it's even more entertaining, I think, to hear from other people and pick up on their knowledge.
My pleasure.
All right. Thank you, Natalie, so much. Again, as far as our podcast is concerned, make sure you do like and subscribe. We did open up a Patreon, so if you want to,
we got some cool stuff like a secret Discord. There's ways to suggest episode topics that we will adopt. There's pins, and I don't know, there's all kinds of cool stuff. Just at least check it out. You know?
If there are any FBI agents who want to listen in on our Discord or hear the episodes before they get
all you
released,
gotta do is pay a few dollars,
and
you can have up front. We'll use our real names within Discord.
So that's the way we'll sucker some FBI agents in.
But if we say, "Are you FBI?" you have to say,
"You have to."
I'm
Are
FBI.
you FBI? You have to say you're FBI. And also, if we say that we're going to plot revolution, all we have to say is JK, and then we're no longer liable for it.
That's also true.
Anyway, it is patreon.com/ProlesPod.
PROLESPOD.
Yeah, just like that.
And Natalie, where can people find you?
They can find me on Twitter at Natalie Revolts, or they can find me on Patreon, patreon.com/Natalie Revolts.
Excellent.
Fuck yeah.
All right. Well, everybody have a great evening or morning or afternoon, depending on what time you're actually listening to this bullshit. Thank you so much for listening.
Bye.